Joining me right now is Kristy and Cameron. Thank you so much for both for joining me.
Hello.
Thanks for having us.
So let's start with Afghanistan. What's going on there, Kristy?
A massive humanitarian crisis that no one really wants to talk about. Basically the borders are closed. There's some ability for some to get to Pakistan if they can afford a visa and if they're not also targeted there. The State Department is working behind the scenes to help some in the late stages of the special immigrant visa program, but all of these countries talked big about how we're going to save 50,000 Afghans or 100,000 Afghans or whatever, and all these processes are so bogged down that a lot of people aren't going to live long enough to get these visas with the current state of affairs. And the Taliban is definitely not moderate. They've broken every promise they made. They are targeting and killing. There's been hundreds of documented cases of retribution killing, which means that the real number is probably in the thousands. But probably what's killing the most people is just a massive humanitarian crisis where 80% of their economy or something was based on foreign aid that mostly dried up. And yeah, the Taliban sells some opium, but they don't have much of an economy. So especially the people in hiding are just living on savings, and eventually they run out of savings, and then they don't, it's not like they can just go get a job, because most of the jobs, there are going to be some labor jobs that are not directly with the Taliban, but any decent job is going to be constricted to people the Taliban has screened to make sure that they're at least neutral to supportive of the Taliban. So yeah, it's very discouraging, because now the world has moved on, and now if you want to save refugees, you can save Ukrainian refugees. We see a huge disparity in the humanitarian parole program for Afghans. And to be fair, the Afghans do have other visa pathways, like the special immigrant visa, but some of the highest risk Afghans are not even eligible for that because of specific criteria. So then back in September, the State Department said, oh, well, if you got left behind by evacuation, just apply for this humanitarian parole program, and we're going to process it in a few weeks. And all this stuff, and it costs like $575 per person, and many of them have big families. So a lot of Afghan Americans and veterans were shelling out thousands of dollars to try to save people's lives applying for this program. And then USCIS did a backdoor policy change in October so they could justify denying most of these cases, and then didn't process hardly any of the 40,000 cases. The 2,000 that they did process, they denied 90%. And then they announced, I guess earlier in April, that, we're going to do humanitarian parole for Ukrainians. Now they've accepted 9,000 Ukrainians in a program, and they're fast-tracked version of the humanitarian parole. So we have Afghan, and they don't have to pay anything. So we have Afghans that had to pay that weren't even processed 9 months later, and then Ukrainians that have a free version and are being quickly processed and mostly approved. So it's really a big disparity. And I am not of the opinion that every Afghan should be entitled to come to the US, but it's a huge moral failure that we have these unlawful visa delays for people that had worked for the US that meet all those qualifications. Some of them even had their visa already, and they're still stuck in Afghanistan. And I think that's a huge moral failure that we left our partners behind.
There's no longer any flights between Kabul and Qatar?
The State Department is working behind the scenes to get people out of Afghanistan, but for operational security, we kind of have to not talk too much about it. For a while there was absolutely nothing happening, and now there is some, but the rate, so it's good that there is some help now, but the rate at which people are able to get to Pakistan and do visa interviews or whatever, it's much slower than the need. So everything is backed up for multiple months.
Right. I want to bring Cameron in now. You want to talk about what's going on in Ukraine?
Well, just to add, she is of course correct that the world's reaction to Ukrainian refugees has been vastly different from the reaction to Afghan refugees in terms of.
Are you saying that Ilhan Omar has a point?
No. But it's even notwithstanding the logistical ease of obviously Ukrainian refugees who can just sort of walk, to the Western world, whereas Afghans generally cannot unless they're already here. Um, she is definitely correct for the most part with regards to Europe. Um, we're not terribly friendly to either group, whereas Europeans generally are. I mean, obviously it helps that they're next door. But just even on the grassroots, there's definitely a difference in terms of how communities welcome them, you know, how they get their children in school, how people put them up in their houses, things of that nature. But with regards to, the fighting on the ground, I mean, just every day it gets worse and worse for the Russians. They went from attacking Kiev to attacking the entire east to attacking the what
Aren't they
I think what do they call it? It's the Joint Forces Operation Area, sort of along the former
yeah.
border,
Aren't they
to
about to
encircling
open aren't
like
they about to open like a western front in near Odessa?
no,
I mean,
they
like
have
wasn't
absolutely.
there was movement like Moldova or not Moldova, Transnistria. They were planning to
Oh, I mean,
mobilize
that's a joke. That's an absolute joke. If that bunch, honestly, I think just the insanity of everything there speaks to just how stupid they are in thinking that the, 1,000 poorly armed fools there would stand up to even lightly armed Ukrainian units. They'd be wiped out in an instant if they tried that. Um, and they couldn't be supported, obviously, because, the Russian Navy is a joke and is now no longer capable of sustaining operations near, Ukraine, with the number of anti-ship missiles coming in and the number of drones that can now freely roam the Black Sea now that the main SAM carrier of the Russian Navy has been sent to the deep. But now, I mean, it's all about, these three villages in the east, which are fortified to all hell, which could almost certainly sustain themselves for a long time, even besieged, and they're nowhere near besieging them. They don't have the army for this. They don't have the forces. I've seen the Ukrainian Air Force conducting, close air support missions along the front. Yeah, there's just no way the Russians can win, which has been
There
my
was
position since the beginning.
there
Go
was
ahead,
a
Kristy.
claim. Oh, I don't remember what the name of it was, but there was a claim by someone on Twitter that like one of these villages had completely run out of medicine and people were having to get like limbs amputated without anesthesia or something. Do you believe that's true?
Probably. I mean, a lot of supplies are still having difficulty getting to the front just because of Russian attacks on rails and the like. But but in the end, these villages, they always say, what is the line? You need 7 attackers for every defender to win, and the Russians maybe at best are the same, if not being outnumbered. Um, that's just, and with the losses on each side, it's not a recipe to win, even if conditions on the front are difficult for the Ukrainians. All they have to do is grind for time. This is a Russian force that they'll be lucky if they're not encircled quite soon with how bad things are going to their north.
So it sounds like by the fall, if they can hold out till the end of the summer, Russia will be all out of forces.
Well, I mean, I would expect probably by the end of the month, this whole Eastern encirclement will be done. The Russians will eventually move to try and, dig in sort of the, Germany in 1914 bit, but they don't have the force to fight like that. Mechanized armies with maybe, 100,000 guys cannot sustain an occupation of somebody else's country when they're coming for you. Even
Are
total.
you
Go ahead,
are you
Kristy.
concerned about Putin conscripting a bunch of people? I mean, it seems like their heart's not really going to be in it though, and they won't be well trained even if he does. Like
Well, their current army's heart isn't in it, so that doesn't help them there. But they don't have the equipment. We've already seen them arming their separatist friends, and even their
Wagner.
lower. Well, no, they always have the best stuff, but their lower echelon units with like Moisens and helmets from the 40s. I mean, they are digging stuff out of that was outdated back then, and digging it out from modern combat versus an enemy that is getting obviously the best Western equipment across the front, artillery, guns, drone. I mean, the amount of damage they've been able to do with a $500 drone with a couple mortar rounds tied to the bottom is just insane. To a point, I mean, how do you fight in a trench when, a drone you can't see, you can't shoot down because it's so small, can drop, an anti-tank grenade on your head when you're sleeping? There's
Right.
just no way.
I want to. Oh, sorry. So I wanted to bring both of you in, like, just to talk about. Apparently, I saw news on Friday that Turkey was blocking Finland and Sweden's ascension to NATO. Like, what is with that?
No, we saw, what's her name? The NATO secretary said they will not be doing that today.
Okay.
So obviously they had I'm sure they had to give them some bullshit statement behind the scenes about how, oh yeah, we hate the Kurds too, to get the Turks on side. But even, I mean, the problem is that, the Turks obviously it's Turkish drones doing a lot of the damage. But Turkey obviously had a lot of interest in Ukraine before, this all started. So they have no reason to side with, the Russians, especially as their interests continue to collide with Russia's.
I mean, they've been getting a lot of like aid from like Russian military, like they're buying like new planes from them. So I mean, I've always gotten the sense, and you can maybe comment on this as well, Kristy. I always got the sense that like Turkey and Hungary were kind of like the weaker links in the NATO chain. Like they've been drifting away from the West for a little bit now under both Orban and Erdogan. So I just got the sense that if we were going to trade, if we had to trade Turkey and Hungary for Finland and Sweden, that seems like a pretty easy trade, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think Turkey geographically is strategic, but ideologically, I would definitely agree that they have been drifting away. And there were a couple of years ago, there was the whole discussion about, I mean, the Trump administration was kind of trying to discourage them from buying Russian equipment. Basically, they bought a bunch of Russian military equipment that they'd promised not to buy, and then the US didn't really do anything. I think part of that is I think a lot of our presidents have had some foreign interest in Turkey too. So I think there's both. I mean, there are national security reasons that the U.S. is trying to keep Turkey, so to speak, in their orbit. But then also, I think there have been personal reasons where past or current presidents may have business dealings in Turkey that they don't want to lose. So I don't think it was strictly national security. In that, I mean, when the US decided to yank out of Syria, I mean, we had a sort of delicate peace, but it was working. The US just had embedded with the Kurdish forces. The Kurds were actually keeping ISIS under control, and the Turks were not shooting the Kurds because they didn't want to shoot them with the US there. And then Erdogan made a phone call, and Trump was like, yeah, sure, we'll get out of here. And then what happens like 3 days later, of course, the Turks start shooting the Kurds. And the Kurds really have been key allies to keep ISIS in check in Syria. And there's a lot of, at least rumor about, ISIS guys that had been to Turkey multiple times. And then when Kurds got control of these areas, Turkey's like, oh, we need a border wall for our security. It was like when ISIS was running it, they didn't, they didn't care. And it's probably not coincidence that Turkey was not notified about that ISIS commander that was killed like a few miles from their border. That's probably because the US was afraid he was going to be told to get out of Dodge if Turkey knew that he was about to get shot. So yeah, I think Turkey plays both sides of this. I think they support groups that destabilize. I mean, they claim to be on the right side of history fighting terrorism, part of NATO and stuff. But I mean, I think we have good evidence that they're doing stuff behind the scenes that is not supporting Western
Seriously?
interests.
Okay, so I'm just getting a notification that this thing is going to end in like 10 minutes because we're multiple people here. Oh yeah. So we may have to like do this like recording in several parts. Is that okay?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's unfair to compare Hungary and Turkey. I mean, Hungary is, for all intents and purposes, a Russian vassal, whereas Turkey just wants to be it wants to be a superpower again. They ache for the days before World War One. But I mean, they have the fundamental problem that, with the exception of the Kurds, virtually every one of their interests are against Russia's. So, and the Kurds, I mean, you know, in Syria, they have the problem of they don't want to just remove Assad, even though that would obviously be the best option. So they're forced to use very sketchy proxies. A lot of them do have, connections with Al Qaeda and ISIS. Um, so, as usual, it's complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Along with the Kurds obviously being complicated given their pattern for, sketchy attacks and, things over the years. Even though obviously in Syria the peace was working. And it's a shame that it broke down.
Yeah, for sure. So one of the things I'm wondering is like, I'm just starting to think of this like from Putin's view. Like if he can successfully somehow drive a wedge between Turkey and NATO, I mean, as you pointed out, that's not so easy to do. But if he could pull it off, would that potentially be a adequate compromise for losing ground in the Baltic Seas by potentially improving his position in the more warmer waters of the Black Sea?
I mean, they're a super pariah state. The Turks have no reason to help them, especially with, the Turkish election coming up, in which Erdogan is, considerably down.
Well, that's what we thought about Orban, and look how
He
that
wasn't
turned out.
down. He wasn't down though. The polls were tied at the very best, and most of them showed him still winning. Whereas in Turkey, he's considerably down to, a professional political figure.
Okay, so Erdogan could lose, but so you think there's no chance he's gonna abandon NATO and open up the the Turkish Straits to Russian warships?
Not anymore. Not after this shit show.
Okay. I mean, Kristy, if you have any thoughts on this, please feel free to weigh in.
I kind of think that the fairly coordinated Western response against Russia's economy could have discouraged people from countries from trying to side with Russia. Although I think that there should have been, I think Europe is still buying Russian gas. And so I'm not saying that the West couldn't have done better, but Turkey had been sort of trending towards Russia, but now that Russia's sort of outed themselves as doing this and drawn a lot of negative attention, then it could have the effect of making Turkey more cautious of cozying up with Russia.
Useless Germans.
Yeah, I know. I mean, like, do you see Austria blocking Ukraine's ascension to the EU? I mean, I mean, Austria, like making trouble for the West since 1914. Am I right?
Yeah, I would imagine most of those governments will have to fall in line. The problem for like Hungary is it's now alone.
Because Poland's no longer on their side.
Yeah, Poland, they'll be lucky to not be invaded by Poland, attempting to run interference for the Russians.
Yeah, and
any further than they already have.
And this year, like a similar government in Slovenia was ousted.
Yeah, I mean they were fairly still pro. They were anti-EU but pro-Ukraine, like most Eastern European governments. Although as we see for like Bulgaria's new government, had a lot of pro-EU types, whereas not necessarily the most, pro-NATO types.
Right. And then Russia just pushed Bulgaria firmly into the European camp by cutting off their natural gas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, they've made life very difficult for all of their friends, and even potentially turn them into traitors in a lot of places. I don't know if they've really thought through the whole Russian citizens mean we have a casus belli to invade bit. A lot of I mean, I know Latvia is starting to crack down on the Russian language and I mean
that's
pro-Russian entities.
That's going to be Kremlin propaganda, isn't it?
I mean, they're fine. I mean, but that kind of stuff has to happen. It's like the pro-Russian parties in Ukraine. You cannot tolerate explicitly seditious entities
But
existing.
it's sort of like cracking down on like speaking Russian in Latvia. That to me is like, yeah, maybe that's not necessary.
Well, perhaps not necessary, but it does send the right message. These are not reasonable people we're dealing with here. These are people that explicitly endorse, mass murder. And there's no
People living
reason
there,
to.
I'm
Oh,
pretty
yeah.
yeah, because like the Russians that I personally encountered are actually on Ukraine's side. Like when like the people at least I talk to, maybe the most of them are in the United States, but the Russians I talk to who are in the United States, and some of them who are even in Russia itself, who I talk to online, they side with Ukraine.
I mean, if they're communicating, with you, then they're, probably a significant outlier. Whereas, I mean, you see these
I mean, they're
crowds,
probably on websites that
holding,
are not censored by the Russian government.
pro invasion protests, pro invasion messages, even though they've had to sort of be quiet given the public backlash, they were fully in favor of this when it first happened.
Right, but a big
and they need to pay for that.
A big factor has been like, believe it or not, Telegram, which is encrypted and is not controlled by the Russians. People who who have relatives in Ukraine on Telegram are giving them the full story, and then you have like these Russian mothers who whose friends have lost sons in battle, and they wonder if their sons are going to be next.
But I mean, you get, there was an intercepted phone call I saw yesterday of, a soldier telling his mother that, it's not going very well here. My unit's at like a third of its original strength. And she's like, yeah, but you're there fighting the West. It's, basically a holy war.
That sounds pathological.
I mean, these people are not, they're not sane. They're not reasonable, and they shouldn't be treated as reasonable people.
Yeah, but I agree with you, Cameron, in terms of the Russians who are supporting it. But I mean, you always do have dissenters. So, I mean, if you look at, so you can have a government in power in the US, and I mean, half the people are going to hate the government, and Russia might have more unity behind Putin, but you should be able to distinguish between, even if it's 90% or 80% of the Russians that do support their effort, there are going to be Russian dissenters. And so, I mean, it shouldn't be like, oh, well, everybody who speaks Russian, must support Putin if that's not the case. So, I mean, I think you can see both sides of it, is that if you, well, I guess I'll say, I can see both sides of this argument where, I mean, Jonathan's saying if you're cracking down on someone just for speaking Russian, which doesn't mean that you're necessarily supporting Putin, then it just sort of looks like aggression on the West part. But if you're tolerating people that are basically just there to undermine your government, then yeah, you're tolerating sedition. Right. So it's kind of a fine line, even something we have to deal with in the US. It's like, we have free speech, but how much is too much, and like at what point are you promoting violence instead of exercising your First Amendment rights?
Okay, so well, Kristy, I have to cut you off there because we're actually running out of time on this segment. I'm gonna have to ask like people like in like few words, like what is their think the metaphor is for this war. I think that it's Napoleon's invasion of Russia or the Falklands War. Cameron?
Falklands War is probably a pretty decent example.
Okay, and Kristy?
Yeah, I guess I would say like Napoleon's invasion of Russia.
Okay, so unfortunately I have to end the segment here because we're about to run out of time. When we come back, we're going to talk about more of the United States and other countries, so stay tuned. All right, we're back with Kristy and Cameron, and I want to talk about some elections that have been taking place, not just in the United States, but around the world. Let's start with Northern Ireland. Cameron, you probably have a lot to say about this.
I mean, not particularly. The result isn't that surprising. The DUP has been screwing up for a long time with regards to corruption and with regards to other things. Otherwise, I mean, the election was basically a census as usual, with only the alliance sort of gaining down the middle. But even then, they're often said to gain supporters fairly equally between both sides. I'm pretty sure they draw mostly from unionists.
Yeah,
about 2-1.
Despite the basically the outright win of Sinn Féin, I ran a calculation. I think that it was like 41-38 for the Unionists.
Yeah, the Unionists still won more seats. And the DUP only lost because lost first place because of the TV and some independent Unionists.
So
Um,
you don't think that Sinn Féin will be able to make good on their promise for a border poll?
oh God, no, and nor would such a poll be legal. There is not support for reunification.
So you mean that the nationalists would have to get more votes?
A majority.
Well, that's not happening because
Well, they're not a
Northern
majority, so
Northern Ireland's population is becoming less sectarian. So that means, if anything, the only party with the chance of a majority is the Alliance. At the trends that we're seeing, the Alliance will get a majority sooner than the Nationalists.
yeah. Well, I mean, with the trends we're seeing, there will be a Catholic majority eventually.
I mean, but by your interpretation, a border poll will never happen.
I mean, you could, in theory, say once, say 30 years, say the nationalists are 50, or Catholics are 55% of the population. You could very easily see a significant swing among nationalists to get themselves over 50 if they really wanted it. If there was really support for that kind of thing, that's what you would see.
I'm convinced right now, by the way, that a border poll, if it happened, would pass.
It'd fail. There'd be no way. Because it's still split 50-50, and there are a lot of soft nationalists who would rather not.
Yeah. I'd say it would pass, but what's more important is the economic arguments rather than the whole nationalist versus unionist arguments.
Well, I mean, they're the same arguments. It's very similar to I mean, culture doesn't really describe or define anything anymore. But I mean, it's the same with Scotland, where the SNP still makes a mostly economic argument. Combined with anti-Tory stuff.
Yeah,
but
Kristy, you can jump in whenever you want, just so you know. I mean, Scotland, I think, amazingly enough, despite everything, is still on a knife edge. Like the idea that it's amazing to me, but I don't think that a referendum would necessarily pass in Scotland the way it would in Northern Ireland, because amazingly enough, despite seemingly everything that Boris Johnson has tried to do, and with Brexit, Scottish people are still just like on a knife edge in terms of whether they support independence or not.
That's why it'll never happen. The SNP won't risk it unless they're sure they'll win.
Yeah, there was a result, I think, in like a local, election where apparently there was a huge swing where the Lib Dems took a seat over the SNP. That was a pretty satisfying result.
Sounds about right.
Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, I mean, we'll have to see what happens in Northern Ireland and I guess in Ireland as a whole. But moving on, there's an election next week in Australia. I have not seen any recent polling on this, but where do things stand?
It's not going to be good.
That people were saying that last time, remember?
Yeah, but you don't get lucky twice.
Okay. I mean, there's a possibility that the polls could be wrong again. I mean, and as Scott Morris, Kristy, I feel bad for just almost excluding you from this conversation, but Scott Morrison, is someone I consider to be like a world leader because of his willingness to stand up to China and decouple Australia from China. Like, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I just want to make sure I didn't lose either of you two.
Yeah, I'm here still.
Okay.
So then, Cameron, from what you're saying, are you expecting then that the more conservative party is going to lose?
I would expect a Labour majority by quite a bit, maybe 10 points would be my expectation.
No, that would be quite a turnaround.
Well, I mean, if we want to talk about a turnaround, New Zealand has a much more interesting one. I have no clue who they managed to kill accidentally, but the opposition is doing better and better every time I see
Does
a poll.
New Zealand have an election coming up? I thought their next election's not until next year.
That's true, but the polls are swinging.
Yeah. So the Nationals could come back. Jacinda Ardern could be booted. I'll take that as a yes.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's quite a turnaround because they got an outright majority, which is impressive considering New Zealand's system.
I was reading in, I guess maybe it was The Economist or something about how, well, China is seeing a resurgence of COVID, and now they've decided to go with the sort of draconian lockdown to try to eliminate all COVID.
Zero COVID.
Yeah, and then like I was like 80% of businesses that do business in China or something said that they, were concerned about this, and of course that does, like, we're still probably suffering from supply chain issues from the first COVID lockdowns, but I mean, because it makes you a little disappointed in humanity that we really don't care about their concentration camps. We just care about their COVID lockdowns that disrupt supply chains. But it is interesting. It seems like maybe a bit of a self-defeating policy.
I mean, we care. This is just the cynic in me, but I think it's just we care about Han Chinese more than we care about Uyghurs and Tibetans. I don't know. Maybe it's just a cynic in me.
Well, I would say nobody cares about any people, really facing, significant crimes against humanity.
Yeah,
well, I mean, let's take this. Say Kiev had fallen, and when the Russians are doing what they're doing in the areas they control, but everywhere, would we really care? Doubt it.
I mean, my father was pointing out once that that China's control of Xinjiang, Inner Mongolia, and Tibet, as well as Russia's control of the Caucasus, as well as various other ethnic republics, it's really the last vestige of settler colonialism that has been allowed to stand. Much as the rest of Europe has decolonized, Russia and China have been allowed to keep their colonies. And so,
yeah, and it's not even just a colony. I mean, China is actually, like, the West can deny it, but I mean, we have good evidence that China is actually literally committing a genocide. So I mean, they're arresting people for no reason and like putting them in these re-education camps that a lot of them never come out of. So it's not, it's not just that they're economically exploiting them. I would argue though that there is ethnic exploitation that goes on in other countries too, not just Russia and China. Like Pakistan controls largely Baloch and Pashtun areas, and they'll just go through and massacre Baloch people because there's Baloch separatists, and so, and those areas want to be independent of Pakistan, but Pakistan is just maintaining control of their territory by force in the ethnic minority states. But yeah, it's not, but like in China's case, it is colonialization, but it's not just colonialization, it's also genocide.
Right, for sure. And I just hate to keep jumping around, but like I kind of want to come back to Europe moment because I saw this result. Apparently there was a local result in Germany. Apparently the AfD just got completely shut out of power. From I don't know if you know what I'm talking about, Cameron, right?
It was did the CDU get a majority?
I forget what it was. All I saw was AfD just shut out.
I believe it was quite close. Let's see. Who the most?
Anyway, while Cameron's looking that up, I've always found it curious that like the AfD and like other like extremist groups in like other places are kind of faltering, but like in Spain, Vox is not seeing that kind of collapse. Like there seem to be some as like a more reasonable alt-right party compared to the AfD or other parties like that.
Well, because they're not as unreasonable. It's sort of unfair to compare, every party in the far right and far left with each other across all of Europe, because obviously they're very different. I mean, you have say very we'll say even like the Italian, most of its, or at least half of its far right is fairly, anti-Russia, whereas the other half is fairly pro-Russia.
Which one's pro, which one's anti? Brothers of Italy and Northern League, which one?
The League is more pro, the Brothers are more anti. At least they were in the past. It's not very easy to be pro-Russia these days, so they're all shutting up about it.
Yeah, but isn't like the Brothers of Italy like descended from like the Mussolini fascists?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, yes.
I mean, only in the broadest sense. They've had a lot of iterations over the years.
Or
So
someone
it's
like or someone like Geert Wilders in the Netherlands. What I find absolutely funny is that a lot of these far right parties, despite like descending from like Nazi parties, like these parties nowadays are actually very pro-Israel.
well, they're lying about it. That's why
Oh, they're lying about it.
they're pro-Israel, so they can be uniformly anti-Muslim. It's not really
Like
done for the.
Wilders.
Yeah, he's fairly pro-Russia these days, isn't he?
Ugh, I don't hear him often that much. The last time I saw him was at the RNC in 2016.
It's problematic.
Yeah. Anyway. So, but it seems like there are some places where I would argue that the pro-Russia, quote unquote, far right, or at least, what's now the far right has gotten to power, like Hungary, for example. I would argue that Fidesz, which used to be a mainstream right party, is now far right.
They were mainstream for about a few years, long enough so they could take power, and then they dropped that.
Yeah, someone's in the garage behind. I'm like, like a office behind the garage, and like so there's like a lot of knocking going on there. So if that's what you're hearing, that's what that is. Yeah, I'm kind of just hopping all around the world. Has there been anything oh yeah, there was an election in South Korea like several weeks ago that was a big victory for the pro-Western.
That was a good victory.
Yeah, you know what I'm talking about, Kristy? You're muted.
I think I did read something. I don't remember the names of the parties. I did read something about that.
Okay.
That the more ones that were more interested in allying with the U.S. and ones.
Yeah, it's interesting how like South Korea is like possibly the most socially conservative democracy in the world nowadays. If you understand what I'm talking about, right, Cameron? Like, for example, majority of South Koreans are actually anti same-sex marriage to this day.
I believe that.
Which is which is no longer the case in Japan, by the way.
I'd be surprised if the Japanese cared.
Yeah, I think a poll I saw said 65% of Japanese now support same-sex marriage.
Sounds about right. Although I doubt such socially liberal
So what
views
was
will
that,
ever
Kristy?
actually find
Oh, well, I think the Biden administration has sort of reversed these policies, but if you remember, like somewhat towards the end of the Trump administration, there was, I think President Trump was pushing South Koreans needed to pay more, and South Koreans and the Japanese needed to pay more for their military base.
Honestly, based on what's going on, I'd very much be open to Japan and South Korea getting nukes at this point.
Surely Korea may pursue them. Japan won't.
Japan won't.
It's not pacifist enough.
I mean, Japan, like, surely the political will now would be there to ditch that article in the Constitution mandating pacifism, right?
I don't believe they have the votes, do they?
Well, that's unfortunate, because Japan still is technically at war with Russia.
Yeah. Well, I think since the beginning they should have retaken those islands by force, just while the Russian army was in the west.
Just like Poland should have just taken Kaliningrad.
That'd be a little harder because there's a ton of people there, but everywhere else would be fine.
Yeah.
It's kind of crazy actually to think about how like we're talking about our allies of Germany and Japan, and I guess 80 years ago our grandfathers were dying fighting.
Well, I mean, the British and French would have been talking about, them being allies in 1940, whereas, a generation before, or 2 generations before, they would have been mortal enemies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's amazing how quickly these coalitions change. Like, for example, I think the 21st century axis is Russia, China, and Iran.
It's about right.
Yeah, I have friends that would add Pakistan and Turkey to that list too.
Yeah, I guess Pakistan in a way. Most of the trouble going on in the world kind of stems from those 3, but I guess Pakistan is kind of its own thing.
Well, Saudi Arabia Pakistan has like a lot of the world's terrorist training camps, and it's like Saudi Arabia pays Pakistan to run the terror training camps. I mean, I have an Afghan refugee my family's been helping for a while, and he says that's that terrorism is the national industry of Pakistan.
Yeah, Kristy, I wonder why India
about right.
doesn't step up to do more to tackle Pakistan. Like you
Why,
think
what?
in
They're
India
at war with Pakistan. Well, they're at war with Pakistan. What else do you want them to do?
Yeah, I think India. Yeah, well, actually, Indian and Pakistani hostilities kind of peaked a couple of years ago, and I feel like India is kind of like in this awkward situation where they're trying to get as much aid from everybody as they can. So they're kind of trying to sit in the middle of the US and Pakistan and Russia. Like they're hostile with Pakistan, but they're probably under US pressure not to try to start World War III over there. I mean, there was like a couple of years ago, there was actually serious concerns that Pakistan was threatening to start nuking India. Because India took possession. Well, there's this disputed territory, and India kind of marched in and said it's ours, and Pakistan made a big stink and made all these speeches about how much they care about human rights, even though they like disappear thousands of people in extrajudicial killings every year. So, yeah, I feel like India, and maybe also they're somewhat distracted by their own domestic disputes. I mean, there are some Hindu nationalists in India. Which also can be fairly like at least anti-Christian. I mean, there are serious issues with like persecution of Christians and Muslims in India because of some of the like far right Hindus. And so I don't know if that like religious issues sort of makes them reluctant to ally with the West. I just feel like India is sort of trying to play this middle game, stay in this middle ground and not be too Western, but they kind of want to be friendly-ish with the West, but not too Western.
To this day, I wonder whether after 9/11, whether the United States should have invaded Pakistan instead of Afghanistan. And maybe if they took out Pakistan, the Taliban would have collapsed on its own.
I think it is Pakistan that keeps the Taliban propped up. I mean, it's also a very populous state and a nuclear power.
Right.
A part of the issue with invading is that like now you have just created this power vacuum. That's part of what happened in Afghanistan and Iraq. I think Pakistan is a huge world nemesis, but like if you do just go in there and topple the government, I mean, you could always end up with something worse. So it makes it difficult. But the US has never really tried to. There was like a glimmer of hope that Trump was going to kind of crack down on Pakistan. Like Nikki Haley called him out for supporting terrorism and this kind of stuff. And it looked like the Trump administration was going to try to do what Bush and Obama refused to do and like actually try to use diplomatic pressure to say you guys have to stop harboring terrorism. But then I feel like President Trump just kind of got distracted with other issues and let Pakistan slide. And what I don't understand is why the US has not come down more firmly on Pakistan. Like, no, we're not going to give you money if it just keeps getting sent to terrorists. It just doesn't make sense. We just look the other way on Pakistan stuff and pretend that they're some kind of ally, and there really should be more accountability for them using their foreign aid to hire terrorists.
It's because there's multiple factions in Pakistan. There's the ISI faction, which is what is mostly the problem, versus sort of the army and then sort of right-wing faction of the government that's more pro-US versus sort of the more pro-China bit on the center left, the ones that just got kicked out of power. And so there are far too many factions to exert any real pressure, and they are in theory still our allies.
Yeah, I mean the military has always kind of run at Pakistan, if I'm correct. Like they've had the facade of democracy, but it's really the military calling the shots.
Yeah, well, they had like a soft coup a few weeks ago. Basically, the military just told the president like you're done, and then he left. So, actually, I think he lost enough votes in Parliament that they just like threw him out. But I mean, here you can't. I mean, obviously, we do have the impeachment process, but it's not just as simple as you get a majority in Congress, and then you can just throw the president out, and everything's fine.
When you have a Westminster system, you can do that.
That's why so they just said, you're done. And the old president had been in jail. They sprung him from jail and said, okay, you're forgiven for all the corruption that got you in jail in the first place, and now you can be president again. And we'll bring your corrupt brother back from London or whatever.
The guy pissed off the wrong people. You don't threaten to, purge the military of your enemies without having the votes or the guns.
Even even Lukashenko knows better than to piss off the military.
You mean
Yeah.
Imran Khan? Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, no, he explicitly said, I'm about to fire the Army Chief of Staff. Good luck.
Yeah, it's like the
Shockingly,
yeah. So go ahead.
well, no, I mean, I'm kind of surprised they haven't arrested Khan yet. Calling for revolution in the streets, trying,
Is he still in the country, or is he?
I think they didn't they take his passport? I know they took the passports of all of his friends.
Okay, because a lot of times these guys manage to like get on a plane to Qatar or Dubai or something before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, I definitely want to move on to UK and the United States, but I'll just say like, the military basically in Belarus basically told Lukashenko, you send us in, you're gone. And basically, I'm wondering, I'm getting that same kind of vibe with like how Khan kind of handled the Pakistani military. But that's just, my own two thoughts. Maybe you guys like how, see it differently.
Well, I mean, that they have an army of what, 20,000 poorly equipped fools, but they are smarter than the poorly equipped fools that the Russians have sent in, since they refuse to be deployed into that. I mean, they need the entire army just to hold the people down.
Yeah.
Um,
Anyway, let's go back to the UK for just a second, because there were some local elections. I believe the Conservatives got their butts kicked. Labour didn't do too well either. Lib Dems had a pretty good night. Greens had a decent night. Is that accurate?
It's about how most local elections go, honestly. The Lib Dem, I know the Lib Dems are really optimistic. They always do well in local elections. And only are sort of gaining back some of the ground they lost. After the coalition. So, but I mean, he needs to go.
Boris.
Absolutely, he needs to go. He should have gone a year ago. And instead, the only reason it's slightly looking better is simply that Stammer managed to commit the same crime he did. You can't rely on your opponent's bad luck forever.
Mm-hmm. Right. Anyway, Boris is I call him like Bozo Boris. Like he like got that big victory in 2019, and it's been all downhill ever since then, except for that one victory in Hartlepool. But I
mean, they did reasonably well in the north.
Yeah.
Defending their previous gains, but it's time for somebody else to come in.
And apparently, like Labour didn't make the gains that they were expected to in London.
I mean, it's difficult to make any more. Well, I mean, the problem with Labour is just nobody buys it. The far left hates him because he's not far left, and the center left can vote for the Lib Dems, who are now sort of back in existence.
Yeah. You think they have a shot in the next parliamentary election?
No. First past the post system. Unless the second party completely falls apart, it's not going to happen.
Yeah. Anyway, it's really interesting because like actually, what was I going to say? I remember like Labour I think made some like gains like sort of in these like I think in Oxford or Cambridge like area, one of these like very upscale areas in the south, but it wasn't in London proper. But like it's
May as well be.
We're kind of seeing the realignment taking place, continuing.
Well, realignment always takes place. I mean, there's very little in politics that can't be predicted beforehand.
Yeah.
Especially in that arena.
You sound
like
what's
the line? Local elections are just a popularity poll on the government.
I mean, that sounds very Bidikofferish. But anyway.
Well, no, except that quote's actually right. Where no.
Okay. Anyway, speaking of Bidikoffer, I want to move to the United States because there's been some primary action that's been pretty interesting lately. In Ohio, like if I had to grade sort of like the states that have had gone so far, Texas still has some runoffs. Indiana, I would give an A. Ohio, I would give like a C or like a D. Nebraska, I'd give an A. West Virginia, I'd give like a B or a C. And we've got some stuff coming up this week. Like For those
Pennsylvania's either going to be an A or an F.
exactly.
No real middle ground there.
Yeah, I mean they could split the difference though. Anyway,
Barely. The problem is that the system just doesn't work. I'm not the world's
so
biggest.
can I just basically do a quick recap? Because we got like 10 minutes left here. Basically in Ohio we got J.D. Vance as the Senate nominee. We got Mike DeWine though as governor, but with a plurality. Apparently the anti-DeWine forces combined for like 50% of the vote. Over in West Virginia, McKinley was knocked off by Alex Mooney, and it was not even close. Whereas in Nebraska, in Nebraska, the Trump favorite for governor fell short, but he actually surprisingly placed second, and without the sexual harassment allegations, he might have won. Whereas that, yeah. Anyway, in Pennsylvania, we got a similar like round robin fight between Kathy Barnett, Dr. Oz, and David McCormick for Senate. And for governor, we've got a fight between. We looks like Doug Mastriano is going to nuke the possible Republican chances of defeating Josh Shapiro. Meanwhile, in the Pittsburgh areas, we have the classic progressive versus establishment fight between Steve Irwin and Summer Lee. And so you got this whole mess that's going on in Pennsylvania. Meanwhile, in Idaho, you've got Brad Little, the incumbent governor, facing his Lieutenant Governor Janice McGeachin, and then you have also a bunch of other things happening, like in North Carolina, you've got Pat McCrory versus Ted Budd. Oh my goodness, there's so much going on. There's all that we don't have enough time to talk about it. But what do you, Cameron, look, Kristy, want to weigh in?
Plurality runoffs are bad. That's what I would say.
Yeah, I think plurality general elections are bad.
Well, the difference is that plurality general elections generally have everybody in the 40s, not the 20s.
Yeah.
If you had, say, an election in which the first place wins with 5 major parties, the system would fail. You can't have a system to where people don't even get a third of the vote and yet they win.
Yeah.
You need runoffs. You need, or either by second rounds or by an instant runoff kind of system.
Trump seems to be moving like a third of the vote in all of these primaries. Like that seems to be the theme I'm noticing, is like 30 to 33% seems to be what these candidates are getting who get the Trump endorsement. I'm curious to know if Mo Brooks is going to end up getting that. Oh wait, Trump withdrew his endorsement for him, so never mind.
No, with somebody else I was talking about. Isn't Katie
Britt?
Winner
Did she get the endorsement?
No, but isn't she the next most likely to win?
Yeah, I guess so. But basically the question I'm going to ask, and this is going to be pretty crass, but when it comes to Pennsylvania, did we fuck up?
Well, I mean, it hasn't happened yet, so.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the only good thing is that McCormick has a significant amount of establishment support, and he's from the right area of the state.
Yeah, I still expect McCormick to win that.
I would say it's probably 50-50 between him and the other one aside from Oz. Barnett is her name.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you think?
I mean, she's the kind of person to where if she spent the entire fall not doing anything, she'd probably win.
Yeah, especially against Fetterman.
It's her campaigning part that's gonna suck.
Yeah.
Fetterman is a terrible I'm astonished how many people like him.
And I'm astonished
he's a terrible candidate, and he's a terrible person.
I'm astonished how little traffic, how little traction Connor Lamb got. Like you might not agree with him. He's halfway decent, and he's generally like middle of the road, like in terms of the way he campaigns and how he sort of maybe not necessarily how he votes, but like he took some like votes to the right in some ways, but he's gaining no traction.
But isn't he? He's a more conservative Democrat, right?
Yeah, he won his first election in a very Trump seat. He's kind of represented a more suburban seat since then. But yeah, he's generally historically been a conservative Democrat. I think he's moved a bit more to the left in his more suburban seat. But other than that, he was the kind of person who would know how to speak to Trump voters, and yet he's gaining no traction.
I feel like primaries though tend to always select the people that more appeal to the base, not necessarily the most electable ones. So that's kind of It's
Yeah.
not surprising, but it's bad strategy because parties will put up these candidates that aren't very electable because they're the ones that got the base excited.
I kind of wish Eric Cunningham was on here to discuss North Carolina because that's also this week.
Yeah, but that one doesn't matter.
There's an interesting race going on in North Carolina 11 that Madison Cawthorn, despite everything,
that one, yeah,
seems probably he's going to win because you only need 30% in order to avoid a runoff.
Has there been any recent polling there?
The last one I saw had him up by about like 35, 37%.
Yeah, but last one when?
Like I have to check. Maybe like several weeks ago or something like that. When these scandals really started happening.
Yeah, but before all the scandal, I haven't seen any primary polling since. And he's not doing anything. He's not campaigning.
He's tweeting.
He's trying. Yeah, he's trying barely even that. He's trying the YOLO hiding strat. And I would say there's too much establishment support against him to win without any real help. He pissed off the wrong people. The scandals are really funny too.
Because he pissed off Tom Tillis.
Yeah.
If you pissed off Tom Tillis, you done screwed up. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, this is going to be probably one of the most meme-worthy nights in the primary cycle, probably by far. As you might have seen the photos, I was with Summer Lee's best friend about a weekend ago in Pittsburgh. I guess I'm going to have my eye on that race just to see how that turns out. I think Summer Lee's going to win. You seem to suggest skepticism at that. Cameron?
What?
Remember when we talked about the Pennsylvania 12 primary between Summer Lee and whoever she's facing?
What did I say?
You said it's a very white working class seat, that like it's not that African American, and you assume that that's why Summer Lee didn't have a chance. And from what I'm seeing, that's not necessarily the case. And I will remind you, Ilhan Omar's seat is also majority white.
Now, obviously, one must note that while her seat, unlike our other squad friend from Michigan, Muslims are counted as white. So that alone doesn't really change anything. But the difference is that in her case, she's facing somebody, I believe, who was more from that sort of Pennsylvania Dem white group, who I believe is still the majority there. So that's why I was skeptical.
But
similarly to the race in Ohio in whatever that Columbus, not
Chantel Brown versus Nina Turner.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that was like a massive. People were actually thinking that Nina Turner was going to win that first primary, whereas I was noticing like pretty early on that Chantel Brown was surging. You might remember that.
Well, I mean, nobody surges in primary races like that, but point taken.
Yeah. Anyway, I noticed we're running out of time once again, but I wish we could really talk more about these primaries, but good folks at Elections Daily are going to have a lot to say about this one the night when it happens. Where can everybody follow you guys?
I'm at Kristy Perano on Twitter.
Is it a funny joke if I say don't follow me? I don't need any more.
Okay, go ahead, say that.
Yeah.
But you can follow me at Red Hill John. And Kristy, Cameron, thank you so much for joining me. I'm so glad we got to talk about everything going on in the world. I hope to have both of you back sometime, either one at a time or together.